I would call upon Dr. Sudha for her presentation. Sudha is an accomplished refractive surgeon of more than 20 years experience. She has been a speaker and teacher in many seminars and conferences. I invite also all the participants to share their queries, thoughts, suggestions, and doubts. The motto of this grand rounds is collective learning. Thank you very much. Sudha, please.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you very much for logging in to the second session of Jyoti LASIK Vision Center's refractive grand rounds. Today's topic is refraction and binocular vision assessment prior to refractive surgery. Some of the commonest causes of, why the slide is not moving. Patient dissatisfaction following LASIK surgery has an underlying basis in refraction and binocular vision.
Dr. Sudha, full screen ಮಾಡಬೇಕು. Slide show.
Yeah. Undercorrection, overcorrection, asthenopia, near vision difficulties, all of them have a refractive basis. And we have to look into this both preoperatively and postoperatively. And in order to ensure that mistakes are not made, we also have to pay a lot of attention to this while doing surgery also. So when you say refraction before LASIK, we want to avoid overcorrection of myopia, undercorrection of hyperopia, ensure that we have the accurate power and access of cylinder. Binocular balance is very important. Fovea and tropias go unrecognized sometimes. Convergence insufficiency is one of the commonest things. We also have to take into account contrast sensitivity and assess dominant eye prior to LASIK surgery. So it all starts with what is the prescription that you are going to treat. So in order to get this final prescription, the starting point would be whether it is comparable to the old prescription or not. So this one would do this at the first consultation prior to LASIK surgery. And this has to be repeated at least 7 to 10 days after discontinuing contact lenses. Tight-fitted lenses, toric lenses, RGP lenses have a tendency to warp the cornea, resulting in a gross mismatch of corneal astigmatism, both in amount as well as in axis. An ideal trial frame should be selected in order to make sure that we do not have tilting of lenses. The adjustment of back vertex distance should be available in the trial frame. Lenses should be properly centered, especially in those people who have a prominent nose or saddle shaped nose bridge. The dialing of cylinders should be easy within the trial frame. And if you notice in this picture, in COVID times, it's also necessary to put a fresh mask and tape the mask down to the nose with plaster so that the lenses don't get fogged. And we are not left wondering whether it is a fogging of the lens which is causing blurring or whether it is the incorrect prescription. Choosing a vision chart is also important. An LCD or a projection chart is ideal because it can be customized to each consultation room. As you can see, this particular one has been customized for 9 feet and 10 inches. In the pre-op and post-operative periods, it's advisable to use the same chart we are used to using, whether it is Snellen, ETDRS, Logmar, whatever. Every time the same thing has to be used in the same lighting conditions. A 6-meter chart is best as it relaxes accommodation, but a 6-meter room is a luxury that most of us cannot have. So at least a 3-meter chart has to be used. And it's also good to have a chart which offers us other options such as duochrome test, Würz 4-dot and contrast sensitivity, so that many of these tests can be done using one gadget only. Even in myopia, we need to do a cycloplegic refraction and a post-mediatric test. Once you have the spectacle refraction subjective acceptance in place, duochrome test, streak retinoscopy with plus 1.25 or 1.5 diopter neutralization, and addition of 0.25 diopter fogging are some of the techniques that we practice in order to make sure that we are not overcorrecting myopia. Now, if you do find that the patient has got a slightly overcorrected prescription, one should change that to a new glass and make the patient wear it for a few weeks before operating, so that both patient and surgeon are convinced that they are operating for the right power. In hyperopia, tropicamide has no place for cycloplegic refraction. One has to use cyclopentolate, and after full cycloplegia is attained, you try correction with full cycloplegia and document it. The patient is called back after 2 or 3 days, and PMT is done with fogging, and we would also look into duochrome test as well as refraction over full correction in order to make sure that hyperopia is fully corrected. A word on fogging test in hyperopia. It is done as a uniocular test. The other eye should not be occluded because occlusion itself can induce accommodation. The other eye should have a plus lens in the frame, something that will reduce the visual acuity by 3 or 4 lines so that relaxation, accommodation can be relaxed. We start with a lens which is about 3 or 4 diopters higher than whatever we expect the patient to accept, and allow some time for accommodation to relax, at least a minute or so, and then proceed with the fogging test. If you find more than 1 diopter difference between manifest and cycloplegic refraction, such patients seem to have a greater chance of regression.
What's the apex? We
In
know
which
where
case,
this is going next. So, like somebody very eloquently put it, what good is a blind eye in a dead patient?
sorry, is there some question in between?
No, somebody has unmuted themselves.
Okay. Okay, so we can understand now that hyperopia is a lot more complex, and risk of regression is considerable when there is latent hyperopia. Therefore, you have to take time to plan surgery, maybe gradually increase the spectacle correction over a few months, understand what is the best corrected refraction, and then only take the patient up for surgery. When it comes to astigmatism, there are 2 readings that you will be faced with. One is a manifest astigmatism, which you get from subjective acceptance, and a measured astigmatism, which you will get from a aberrometer or even from a pentacam. Generally, the manifest refraction is treated unless we are doing a topolinking or aberrometer guided treatment, like a Contura treatment or so. So the cylinder has to be refined. The Jackson cross cylinder technique is the best way of doing it, and we will come to discuss that technique in the following case presentation. Now that we have a visual acuity recording, does the patient read 6/6 or not? That's a very important point. If pinhole improvement is there with full correction in place, it might still be all right. If not, you have to check for retinal pathology, early cataract, or even formicrostate keratoconus. And if all of them are found to be normal, pre-existing amblyopia should be documented, and visual acuity should be recorded with extreme care so that we do not land up in legal problems. Convergence insufficiency is the commonest cause for binocular imbalance. This is especially so in low myopes who may not be using their glasses regularly. And for both accommodation excess as well as convergence insufficiency, since we now have vision therapy which can help them to regain muscle balance quickly, both of them should be considered before you take a patient up for surgery. Phoreas should be masked, unmasked by cover-uncover test. And if a patient gives a history of strabismus surgery or occlusion therapy, there should be a very, very high index of suspicion that there may be some underlying binocular muscle imbalance. It's useful to have these normative data available at hand so that we can compare them to whatever we record from the patient. And also there is a lot of literature about binocular vision, ocular alignment in pre and post LASIK surgery. And some of the anomalies after surgery are decompensation of existing fourth nerve palsy, vertical phoria, worsening of intermittent phorias, diplopia, as well as change in near point of convergence accommodation, as well as accommodation amplitude. This is an excellent study which has been published by Sumita Muthu and others of Narayan Netralia. They have given very nice flow charts in this paper about how to methodically do non-strabismic binocular vision anomaly assessment in refractive surgery workup. It is really definitely worth going through in great detail. Ocular dominance examination is important for people in the pre-presbyopic age group, especially if you planned monovision correction. And patient counseling also, this is very important because now patients realize that the right eye is different from the left eye, and they understand also much more easily that post-operatively also there can be a difference between the two eyes. So this is how we do the dominance test. With the patient is seeing this thing, and then with one eye, the dominant eye, patient continues to see the screen, whereas with the non-dominant eye, the screen will disappear from view. Contrast sensitivity examination is important to explain night vision issues. The contrast sensitivity screen that you get on vision charts is not very sensitive, but it still gives some amount of idea about whether a high myope has got a pre-existing poor contrast sensitivity. It also gives us an understanding of some post-operative issues, such as patients saying, yeah, everything is very clear, but I cannot identify faces. Everything seems to be sort of hazy and washed out. So that description generally indicates poor contrast sensitivity. So these factors are only some of the issues that are determinants of optical quality. There are other things such as aberrations and neural limitations to visual acuity, which we will take up in future discussions. I also feel that vision assessment is a great counseling tool because patient now understands that vision is much more than a spectacle number. Every test that we do is a chance to counsel a patient about what to expect, and detailed documentation serves as a great medico-legal as well as research tool. So having done all this on the day of surgery, there are certain areas where we can make mistakes which we should watch out for. Subjective refraction should be avoided on the day of surgery. Patient is a little bit anxious and may not really be able to tell you really what is the best subjective acceptance. The prescription given to the assistant should be very clearly written, preferably typed. And once he or she enters it, data entry has to be checked. Nomograms, if applicable, have to be also checked. And surgical safety protocols must be in place. You must never say first patient, second patient, things like that. Patient should be identified by name and laterality. And before starting surgery, assistant must call a timeout and identify patient name and power before firing the laser. Generally, we operate the right eye first. But in case the right eye has a higher power, you are planning for a thinner flap, which you know you will get with second pass of the microkeratome, then the left eye is operated first. This has to be informed to patient as well as to assistant in advance. If all these things are in place, hopefully we will not have a patient who will complain of blurred vision, astigmatism, night vision difficulties, etc. But if we do have one of these symptoms, we have to revisit the refraction and assess non-strabismic binocular vision anomalies all over again in detail. And if we have a detailed documentation of preoperative values, it will become very easy for us to understand what really has changed in the pre-op and post-operative periods. This is an introduction to refraction and binocular vision. Thank you very much to all of you for your patient listening, and to my colleagues in Jyoti LASIK Center for making all this possible. And we will go on to the case presentation, questions from the audience, etc.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Sudha, for an exhaustive. Am I audible? Yeah. Thank
Yeah,
you, Dr.
you are.
Sudha, for an exhaustive coverage of refraction, especially the practical points. I just interrupted here to one pleasant task that I have. We had promised a small gift to the 100th person who becomes a member of our WhatsApp group. And I'm happy to inform that it is Dr. Nitish Narang. He was a fellow of Lions Eye Hospital, Bangalore, and presently he's in Pagwara. He's a cornea consultant in Sri Vishwakarma Charitable Hospital. I think today he was not in a position to log in, and we'll be sending the a small gift of a fully adjustable trial frame to him. Okay, with that, I call upon Dr. Deepthi to present her case. And any questions that anybody has, any suggestions, anything that you would like to add to whatever we are discussing, please use the chat box. Once Dr. Deepthi finishes and the discussants have discussed the topic, we'll open the chat for everybody to participate. Right now, you can keep asking your questions on the chat box so that we can frame those questions. And call upon Dr. Deepthi. Dr. Deepthi is a cornea consultant at the Karthik Netra Lab, Bangalore, and I'm sure all of you are very familiar with her, and she doesn't need any introduction anymore. And I also call upon her vision therapy assistant, Mr. Sonu, to be with her so that the presentation will be a very comprehensive presentation. Thank you, Deepthi, and go ahead.
Hope I'm audible.
You are clear.
Okay. Thanks, Dr. Sudha. That was a very nice platform to start off. So as we thought a lot about this program, we felt, and it's true that refraction is the most variable factor in any refractive surgery, because with today's very advanced laser machines, it's not very tough to do a surgery and very, very unlikely for the machine to treat a wrong power. So invariably, if you have a refractive surprise, we would say first thing would be to go and recheck your refraction. It's not like cataract, which is highly dependent on our surgical skill. Refractive surgery, for the technology it has, is quite predictable. So if it's a happy patient, it has to be a perfect refraction as top one, and your surgical skills would be the next point. So I have a good interesting case. Before that, just to wind up what Dr. Sudha said, our top 6 pearls or tips I would want to give. So it's always nice to have something more than 6.6. So today's patients are very demanding. So we should have 6.5 as our target when we do a refraction. So one thing is we are ensured that we are perfect on a refraction, because 6.5 would not be possible if not. And you would be surprised how many hyperopic patients can reach 6.5. So a lot of our LASIK age group patients can reach 6.5. So let us keep that as a target when we do refraction, just to basically avoid small things like undercorrection of astigmatism or cylindrical power, which could not allow 6.5. So that somehow, if our optometrist says, Madam, 6.5, I'm quite reassured that it should be a perfect refraction. And second thing is, we tend to take high myopes or even hyperopes if they're not reading 6.6 as amblyopes. So I think that is a soft corner we have, and that should not be, because amblyopia can be diagnosed only after exclusion. So if someone is less than 6.6, we feel it should be documented, either do an OCT macula and do everything else. And if your macula is bang on, only then we call it amblyopia. There could be a small scar, we may be missing an FFKC. So make sure all your pre-LASIK patients have 6.6 or 6.5 or an explanation if it is less than it. And today's scenario, it's always nice to add this. If you're given 6.6 parts or 6.9, it's nice to add that sentence in the consent. So there are no legal issues, and we can always tell the patient that you will not reach 6.6. and they're better prepared to face a 6.9 or 6.12. It's very, very rare in low myopes or even medium myopes to have anything less than 6.6 if their macula is perfectly fine. Because amblyopia is not a big issue in them. So my second point would be, now we are depending a lot on optical devices. Now I just did this test with one of my own staff. Now look at the ARK print 1, ARK print 2. So print 1 was 1.25, 20 degrees, and print 2 is 35 degrees. And this was just done 2 days back and in a minute's difference. So what actually is happening here? So only thing that he has done is here he's in perfect alignment, and here he's slightly, very slightly tilted his head. So this is very, very important. We are looking at clinical part, but positioning in any optical device, maybe your Contura or your topography or even an ARK is important. Now this may not be a significant difference when you're just giving glasses, but when you're doing LASIK, a 15-degree difference, you're not even eligible for a Contura Contura procedure or advanced topo guided, because the cutoffs there is just a 10-degree variation. So it's extremely important yourself or the optometrist you trust check this centration, only then go to the machine hand and do your scans. So this was a very small thing we tried, and there's a huge, huge difference. And today's patients, this person knows how to do an ARK and this mistake happens. So for a patient who's getting it done for the first few times, it's very important that we align it. And in a Pentacam or a Placido base, this can be even a bigger difference than in an ARK machine. So always go back to the basics, look at his height, how he's keeping his chin, and only then go to the other end and take the scan. Same as Dr. Sudha said, is even in the trial frame. Even if your trial frame is a 15-degree tilted, you're not going to achieve a 6.6 for sure. Now, duochrome, very well explained again. We can use a duochrome in many other ways. Now, whenever we know myopes, we usually target it towards the red, and red equal to green would be a perfect emetropia. Each of us surgeons may have a little different criteria. So you can use duochrome to a next level. Now, once you have emetropia, you could always stagger between your dominant and non-dominant eye. So if you're dealing with a younger patient, I would give a green on the dominant eye and a red on the non-dominant eye. So this is not monovision, this is micro monovision. So to that extent, you can refine your refraction using tests like duochrome. And whenever we do a surface ablation, especially if it's a younger guy, we tend to go a little bit on green, just one step green after G is equal to R. So that will be, I'm sure, even lesser than 0.25 diopters, because they may regress over a few years. And flap and femtoLASIK, you may probably give red equal to green. So you can use the duochrome for micro adjustments like this. And believe me, fogging, your duochrome goes haywire. So as Dr. Sudha shows, putting the tape is so important. You're never going to get a perfect answer when you have a fog lenses. So make sure you plaster it well and keep checking for the fogging on the lens. Patient may not even understand, because you're going to make him less myopic when you do these tests. So he may not know. So it's our duty to keep checking it, cleaning it, and the unfortunate extra things we have to do during the COVID era. Next thing is a little bit of Jackson cross cylinder. I'm sure this is a very, very useful tool many of us are using. So I'll just briefly show, we use the phoropter for our pre-LASIK diffraction. So I'll just show you step by step, because a cylinder can be refined only by a JCC. So this is the final prescription. Okay. So we have a final prescription, which is say around 1.5 and 2.75 cells at 180 degree. So the first step is always make them a little myopic. So we can make them 1.25 if it is a small power, or even 1. And then you always go and first refine your axis. So before doing this, you have your ARK print, you have the Pentacam print, make sure all of them are 5 degrees this side, that side of 180. And then you go your do your JCC. JCC is very, very easy on a phoropter. So it's just click off a button here, and then you have the lenses which are moving. So once you're done with the let me just go back. So once you're done with the cylinder, then you go back to the axis power, and then once you're perfect with the axis power, then again go back, do your duochrome and put back your R equal to G. So this is extremely important if you want to refine your axis and cylinder perfectly. Now, why you need to make them little myopic? Because if you're fully corrected myopia, as in sphere, the patient may not accept the entire cylinder. So always make them a little less myopic, make sure he takes up the entire cylinder, and then again go back and refine with your duochrome. And right side video is basically to show how quickly the lenses change. So this is how quickly the lenses turn when you do a JCC. So as compared to a trial frame, your patient can judge the difference much, much quicker than in a trial frame. So we feel phoropter has a huge value when you do your ultra refined fine refractions like in pre-LASIK or pre-ICL. Now, next thing which Dr. Sudha mentioned as well is your room is extremely important. Yes, luxury to have a longer space, but you can always in your OPD try to look at places which have that much space, because you know, even if you're doing the same 20 feet test at 10 feet, there is some amount of accommodation that is triggered. So one option we can do is, yeah, if you have the luxury of some room which is that good enough, you can do your refraction in whichever unit you're comfortable. Always bring the patient to the larger corridor, make him sit, just put a simple Snellen's chant, and at least do an overscopy. So especially in tricky patients, low myopes, very, very particular type A personalities, this is one way you can relax, and you don't need to have the entire setup, but just chat and your retinoscope, take it, make him relax his accommodation. And we have different areas of cubicles in our place where we have refraction unit. But we have one particular place, which is the unit we do for all our pre-LASIKs. So again, that I feel is important. If you have multiple areas, the surgeon and optometrist to stick to one place, which is giving you perfect results. And how do we use the ARK? ARK, as we know, is very, very useful. And in the same time, it's made us and our optometrists very lazy, because you get a perfect refraction. We tend to be lazy. So few tips on how to use ARK. ARK can be a starting point, but we know that spherical is always and always overestimated, because all our young patients do have a lot of accommodation when you do ARK. So we do not consider the spherical part. The cylindrical axis and the cylindrical power is pretty accurate on the ARK, because that doesn't change mostly from the cornea and doesn't change with accommodation. So sort of very blindly, you can take that as your starting point. And try to relax your accommodations. So two ways in which you can do that is, all of us know there is a target. So the target is usually an airplane or a balloon end of a road. So mentally you can prepare the patient by telling that there's a long road, please look at the balloon in the end of it. So what does that mean? When you're saying it's a long road end, your patient is sort of relaxing his eye and he's trying to focus at the balloon which is far off. So psychologically, he's trying to look at a far off object. So make sure you take 5 to 10 seconds to explain him. Second thing, what you can do is look at the monitor, put the auto mode off, make it a manual mode. And as soon as you feel the pupil is slightly dilating, you know he's relaxing, and that is the time to shoot your AR. So that again increases your spherical power accuracy in your ARK. So most important thing is there are quite a few things we all know we should do, and it's very easy to forget or not do something when you have a busy OPD, because this usually goes alongside OPD. So always have your protocol. So ours, for example, would be NPA, NPC dominant and cover test. Then the optometrist does an objective and subjective. Then the surgeon does these three important tests, that is duochrome, JCC, and just an overscopy, which really does not take much time in a routine patient. Then we ask the patient to sit for 15 minutes, half an hour. If at all we are planning a monovision, he sits with the trial glasses in the lobby, has a look at his mobile, paper, anything. And then optometrist does a cyclorefraction, and only if there's a significant difference, we call him back for a PMT again, usually by the surgeon. So each of us may have a different protocol we can have, but just make sure the entire protocol is followed so that we don't miss any of these steps during our refraction. So those were few tips. I'm sure there'll be a lot more from the experts. So I'll just go ahead with my case presentation, and then we'll open the forum for discussion. So this was a patient, a 25-year-old lady who was keen on refractive surgeries and glasses from the age of 10 years and very, very stable refraction for 5 years. She was with us for quite some time. So her pentacams were perfectly normal. This is a pre-cataract, pre-LASIK case sheet. So if you look at the back side, let's forget the refraction part. Now here, the left side is a dry refraction, dry ARK, and the right side is a wet ARK. Now again, forget the right eye. When we look at the left eye, now the dry was minus 7.25, a spherical equivalent of almost 9.25, and with wet, the AR is 4.75. So difference of almost 3 diopters, spherical equivalent just by cycloplegic drop. So this is not very common. Hyperopics maybe they expect, but myopic really not a very common scenario. Now this was about the AR. Now coming to the refraction part, this is the entire flowchart of refraction. Now her previous glasses was around -6 with 4.25, which was somewhere between her dry and wet ARK. Then go to the OPD scan. OPD scan is nothing but an IDEC platform which gives us a wavefront refraction. So that also was giving us somewhere around 3, and the cylinder was slightly lesser. And OPD scan in the night mode, that is dilated mode, again the cylinder was lesser and sphere remained the same. Okay, then we go to her dry AR. So as we see, a dry AR is very high. That is because she would have accommodated during the test. But again, my acceptance was around 6.5 with 4. Now, finally, when we had a full cycloplegia and did a refraction after an hour or 1.5 hours, there was a gross drop in the wet refraction. So 6 her glass, 6.5 was my dry, and 4.75 was my wet, which is very unlikely in a myope. So I would just want to open the forum for maybe 2 of them to tell us, what do we do? She's been very comfortable with 6 bang on vision, no astinopia. My dry is around 6.5 and wet is around 4.75. So do we go ahead with the dry because it is matching? Do we go ahead with the wet? With the wet correction, when I did a PMT, she was accepting somewhere around 5.25, but the vision was 6.9, nothing better than 6.9. So what do we do? So Dr. Prashant, if 1 or 2 of you would want to put your thought on how to proceed, then I can share how we proceeded.
Did you see a similar difference in the right eye also?
Yeah, it is very similar. It's just that it's too confusing. I asked you all to look at the left.
Oh.
So right, as you see here, 5.5 was hers. My dry acceptance was 6 and wet was 4.75. So maybe a 0.75, 1 diopter lesser than the difference in the left eye. But again, in the wet, her vision was dropping. It was 6.9 and 6.12 parts.
So we are looking at a patient with an accommodation excess.
Right. So bang on. So what we quickly do is, as we know, we have a thought that myopes may not have, especially such sort of powers. So we do a quick binocular vision assessment. So is Nikhil around? Nikhil is a vision therapist, so I'll just ask him to explain. This is not the entire BVA, but a brief test which he generally quickly does. So Mr. Nikhil?
He's not there. I think he.
Okay, no issues. We'll ask him to join. So basically, these are the 6 basic tests. Won't take much time, maybe around 10 minutes, which we could do in the OPD as soon as you feel. This is certainly not an accommodative spasm because they will have astinopia and the presentation is slightly different. So this is sort of an accommodative excess in between spasm and normalcy, and cover NPA, NPC, accommodative facility, MEM, and NRA, PRA. These are simple tests which all of us can do. So with this, we diagnosed her as a slight accommodative excess. No time today to probably go in detail. But once this was done, this was during the COVID lockdown period. We could not offer her office-based therapy. So we gave her a simple therapy which she can do from home. This is the heart chart. So I'll just play a video how this is done.
Is there an audio along with this, Deepti? Because we are not able to hear any.
Oh, you're not able to hear. Yes. Okay. Let me explain. So what you do, hard chats are easily printable from online chats. So go to an authentic chat. So here it's opposite to a pencil push-up probably. So put it at your eye level and ask him to start reading from the top and slightly keep going back. So at some level, they won't. Am I audible?
Can't hear.
No.
Am I audible?
Yeah,
Yes.
now yes.
Okay, sorry. So keep it at an eye level. Ask the patient to close one eye. Basically, we are helping him relax his accommodation. So ask him to start reading whatever you can see, his O, F, and P, and keep stepping back 1 feet at a time. So when they are in a spasm state, they won't be able to read this up to 25 to 30 feet. Ideally, they should be able to read it up to 20, 25. So at some area, Santosh is saying it's not very clear. So then we ask him to try relax and try again to read it. So like a pencil push-up, but opposite. So he keeps doing this few minutes every day, and he will start noticing it day by day. He's going to go farther and he's going to be able to read. So once he reaches a state where he can read this by around 20, 25 feet, that probably means his accommodation is relaxed. So this is something we could do, give the patient at home as home therapy. We can have better and faster results when it is an office-based therapy, but because of COVID protocols, we couldn't offer her this. So a lot of tests where we can relax the muscle with an office base. So we just called her, we saw her maybe 6 weeks back, we called her 2 days back, and she's saying she's able to read the chart from 20, 25 feet, which was tough for her when she came to us. And we have given her under-corrected glasses. Now, as we saw, the wet was 4.75, so we have given her around 5, and we have asked her to get used to it. The vision with that was 612 when we dispensed, and now on phone, she tells it's much clearer with the same glasses. So we know her accommodation is relaxing, and now is the best time, call her back, make sure the subjective and objective is matching well, and only then take it up. So we can be tempted to just go ahead and do it with a wrist retraction, but there's no point hurrying because more chair time now will be less chair time later. If it is less now, then certainly patient is going to come back and really, really chew our brains. So it's always nice, even if you delay the procedure by 1 or 2 months, really doesn't matter. Give them the actual power, tell them once you start reading 6/6 with this, that's the best time. It's always nice that they've invested so much on LASIK and they see crystal clear on day one rather than asking them to adjust at that time because they are going to blame the surgery after all. So now there is a huge thought process on binocular vision assessment, especially during the COVID era. So even in our OPD, we have seen a lot of BVA in very healthy people because of excessive near work. So I think our LASIK workup, along with how much of importance we give for refraction, we should have a mini BVA, at least a BVA, BVC, a lot of discussion on this in the group before we plan the LASIK. So again, during this last 1 year, we have seen a huge trend. I'm sure all of you have seen this increased accommodative problems in kids in mid-age and in elder because of excessive system use. So with that, as Dr. Sudha said, this is a very nice paper. All of us should read it. And we'll see how it goes. If we have good number of cases, we can have one session of BV and refractive surgery. So thank you. I think before any surgical topics, we wanted to do this because we feel this is the most important and crucial step to get a very happy LASIK patient. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Deepti. I think that was a very, very exhaustive and practically very relevant tips that you could give. I see Dr. Ellen Kumar has logged in, and I don't know if he has gone through the whole lecture. His comments on refraction.
No, sir, I just joined maybe 5 minutes, not even 5 minutes.
I saw that.
Sorry, I had to manage that. It took too much time, more than one.
You were busy with the black fungus.
Black fungus. I think everybody seems to be doing that. You would like to add anything about refraction in your practical tips, how people can,
No, sir. Having attended the pre-conference meeting, I'm sure Dr. Deepti would have covered most of it. But my only thing is, in a busy OPD, for an individual surgeon, it's difficult for him to do the refraction. I accept that point. Almost all refractive surgeries, I used to do it myself. Once became a little bit busy, it's usually the optometrist who does it. But definitely, I've not forgotten that retinoscope, where even after the ophthalmologist had did it, put it on the trial frame, put it on the patient, ask the patient to wear the trial frame, keep a 1.5, because that's my usual working distance, what I use, 1.5, and do a retinoscopy. The crisp reflexes will tell us whether we have corrected this patient accurately or not. So busy OPD is no reason to give not to have checked the refraction. If you can do a full refraction yourself, otherwise at least do this. I don't know what else was covered in this. Definitely the last point is very, very valid. To be a refractive surgeon, you should be a good refractionist first. So that is a primary criteria. Most of it, I'm sure she would have covered, sir.
Thank you, Dr. Alan. There are a lot of questions. Dr. Deepti, would you like to take over and handle the questions?
Sure. As
And
Dr.
Vishal.
Ellen said, I think Mr. Nikhil, are you there now? He's
Yes,
there.
yes, madam.
okay, Nikhil.
Yeah, yeah.
So
I
that's
was
very
unable to
practical.
mute at that time. That is why I couldn't speak.
No problem, no problem. Nikhil, one commonest question we are having is if we may all not have a vision therapist inside. So can you recommend at least 2 to 3 tests which all of us ophthalmologists can do that would help us pick probably accommodative excess or accommodative insufficiency? And what made you think in this patient that you wanted to go beyond regular refraction? So just 2-3 tips and which can use very simple equipment which all of us can buy. If you can tell all of us.
So we can go ahead with NPA, near point of accommodation. You need not to have a RF ruler. If you have a 30 centimeter scale and a small target, a vertical target with N8 size, that's enough to go ahead with the NPA. So whenever you measure a NPA, the patient is asked to report blur at which point she's at the point where she can't see. So taking that centimeter, if you divide it by 100, it will convert into a diopter. And there is a half sector formula where we have to see according to the age. It's like a age appropriate amplitude of accommodation. So it's nothing but 15 minus 0.25 into age. So if you calculate this, it gives the age appropriate diopter. So you cross check with the NPA, amplitude of accommodation, and half sectors formula, half sectors value. If it is anything greater than, means if we'll take an example of 9 diopter of half sector at the age of 24 or 25. So if the NPA amplitude of accommodation is 13, so that is accommodative excess. So if it is lesser than 9, means if it is somewhere around 7, 6, so it's accommodative insufficiency. So that is what we can do. And secondary, we can think of MEM, monocular estimation method. So it's done with a retinoscopy at 40 centimeters, that's all. And ask the patient to read continuously with a 40 centimeter and do a quick retinoscopy. It's little tricky to do it. You should not leave the lenses there in the trial frame. We have to just quickly move it, or else the patient can accommodate with that lenses also. So check
what is your target when you're doing MEM? What is the patient looking at?
It is also N8.
Okay.
N8.
So,
And the normal.
So you will expect with movement with MEM.
Yeah.
Huh?
Yeah.
And how much of this thing would you usually neutralize it with?
It is the normal is 0 plus 0.25 or plus 0.5.
Okay.
So if it is going towards more plus, or if you, for example, if it is going if it is going towards +2, then it is lag of accommodation. So it's accommodative insufficiency. If it is going towards minus, if it is a lead of accommodation, it is accommodative excess. So if you think it is reflecting minus 0.5, then it's accommodative excess. So with
this patient was minus 0.5, right?
Exactly. Yeah. And if you do a NRA and PRA, that would give you a best result. So usually with accommodative excess, they couldn't, they can't clear plus. So they usually get stuck with almost +1, +2, somewhere around within the normal. If there's accommodative insufficiency, they get stuck with a PRA, which is positive relative accommodation. So they can't stimulate their accommodation. So this 3 tests we can do it quickly in the OPD. So it hardly takes around 5 to 8 minutes to finish off this test.
Sorry, Nikhil, can you just repeat this thing? Do not clear +2. What does it actually mean?
Do not clear.
You said they don't clear +2.
Okay. So +2 in plus lenses, usually the patient is supposed to relax her accommodation or his accommodation. Okay.
Yeah.
So while doing NRA or PRA, so NRA means we do it with the plus lenses. Okay. So if when we slowly step up with a 0.25, so the patient might stuck somewhere around +1 or +1.5 or 2. So with the normal is +2.5.
Okay.
So that is how it concludes that the patient is not able to relax her
Clear
accommodation.
plus. Oh.
Yeah. So if it is in the minus, so if patient is somewhere stuck at -1 or -2, it clearly shows that patient is not able to stimulate the accommodation.
Okay.
So this helps with the NRA and PRA.
Madam, can I add something? Actually? Dr.
Yes,
Deepti,
sir.
yeah. What Dr. Nikhil said, those of us who are doing these railway checkups, it is in fact a criteria there that with +2, the person should not be reading the 6/9 or beyond.
Oh,
So
okay.
again, that is related to that only. In fact, railway, they don't ask for the near point of accommodation or whatever, but this is definitely.
Oh, they specify that, is it? Okay.
Yes.
Okay. So we pre or early, we have a question from Dr. Vamsi. Pre or early presbyopic age group, insight on pre-op refraction for myopia and hyperopia. So Dr. Ellen, would you want to take up this? In pre-presbyopic, anything else you would want to do for myopes or hyperopes? Unmute, Madam, sir. You have to unmute. Dr. Ellen, you're not audible.
Sorry. No, I didn't understand the question. Is it other than cycloplegic refraction, near point of accommodation, what else do you want to do in presbyopes?
Pre-presbyopes, early presbyopes or pre-presbyopes, yes.
The main thing we should look at in a pre-presbyopic or in a presbyopic is should not overcorrect these patients. Number 2, always take the binocular vision and then explain to this patient what he will do, what he will have once he enters the 40 plus, that is presbyopic age group, and then proceed with the LASIK. Particularly, this is very important, particularly in myopes, wherein they are distance 6/6 very good, but then the near point of accommodation moves back, and they have difficulty because they are used to reading at a particular distance. Other than this, I'm not able to. Anything else?
Nikhil, can you add in this, like say you have a pre-presbyopic myope, he has -4, and Nikhil, are you there?
Yeah, I'm there.
So imagine he's wearing glasses of -4 all the while, and the second scenario, he's not worn glasses very regularly, -4. So he's 38. What do you feel his accommodation will be? He's using glasses all the time, and second person is not using glasses too much.
So if he's using glasses all the time, then the accommodation would be normal. Or else if with a -4, if he's having a near difficulty at the age of 38, then there is a chance of overcorrected myopia.
Correct.
Okay, and in -4, where he's not wearing, that would lead again, he might not have a clear vision, and that I really don't know how to, how his vision would be. The accommodation, so we can't check because always the patient is supposed to wear the glasses, or else it varies like anything. So we can't even expect how the accommodation acts also.
Regarding treatment of astigmatism, do you consider difference of manifest and topographic astigmatism? So again, in astigmatism, it's very, very unlikely for your topography, ARK, and retinoscopy to not match. So very important one would be an FFKC where you feel your topo and this is not matching. And second thing is redo all the tests by yourself. Many times if the head tilt is corrected, usually bang on, I would say 99% of the time, your axis on the ARK, manifest and topography will be corrected. So, but there you say there is certainly a 10 to 15 degree difference. Then one thing is we cannot go for a topo-guided treatment. Second thing is probably will err more on the manifest refraction. So even if your topo is showing 10 and all your other scans, your AR is showing 25, we would have to treat their manifest refraction only after checking it with a proper cyclo, because there can be some amount of lenticular astigmatism which will again get revealed with a cyclo. So if there is, you're sure there is a 100% difference between topo and manifest, I think majority of it, we would do a manifest refraction and inform the patient that there is a difference like this. And if at all is the lenticular part which relaxes after a few years, he may have a small refractive surprise. So OPD scan would be very handy in such places where we can differentiate internal astigmatism and the corneal astigmatism. Another reason would be an internal astigmatism because of the posterior corneal surface and also because of the lenticular astigmatism. So doing this, we can differentiate both, but end of it, we need to treat the manifest only. But after telling the patient properly, but there could be a small cylindrical regression. So anything else you would want to add, Dr. Elan, on that? Dr. Priyank, on when you have your manifest and topo to be different? I think that's a very practical problem, especially when you do topo guided and contours. You would see, some patients are not matching and you really can't offer the contour and those advanced treatments to them. So we will have to add or benefit of doubt, do it towards the manifest. So Dr. Priyank, what would be the protocol for a lady who wants to plan a family, maybe after 6 months or so, after 3 months? Okay. Priyank, can you explain? Is that a question or your answer?
No, it's a question. It's a question.
So last time also we did discuss, if they are in that process, we will, especially if they're on hormones and other things, we would wait for 6 months post or ask them to delay that if LASIK is their priority for a few months and do a LASIK, give few months and then they plan. But yes, if they're probably a lot of patients today are on IVF and lot of hormonal therapy, best is to avoid and do it only after they stop lactation. So yes, 6 months or after 2 months after they stop lactation would be ideal.
Sir has that valid point. Old trial frames, I think better.
Yes.
Yeah, Dr. Sudha, can you, you told very well about the trial frames. So can you let us know which companies have a good trial frame with the vertex correction, which is the one you use and how do we upgrade if you have a contact number of a good trial frame, one of you're using?
Whatever I have, I've sent the thing. If you want on the refractive, that WhatsApp group, I can send a picture of the trial frame as well as the person that I bought it from. It has lasted me for quite a few years, so it is quite durable also. And the thing is that the print on that frame does not go away very easily. That is especially important because now we are cleaning the surfaces of the trial frames also so much more frequently because of COVID. The axis marking and all that does not get wiped out so easily. So that is also an important thing, and adjustment of the trial frame on the nose is very important actually. You can even get a measure of PD also, which may not be so important for LASIK, but the older this thing trial frames are there, which I have also shown in that slide. Especially if that side screw becomes loose, then they are all over the place, you know, and so many times you're forced to hold it against the forehead like this and balance it before you can stabilize it well enough in order to get a proper binocular reading. Otherwise, they keep on saying that no, it is double, one is above, one is below. Those kind of things you have to hear from the patients. So the trial frame being stabilized properly on the face, aligned correctly, is very important for get, especially in the higher powers.
Another tip, if you're having a high myope or high hyperope, there are several slots on your trial frame. So it's always nice to put the highest power closest to the eye to reduce the work-test issues, and then the smaller adjustment in the front. So is there a correction factor, like say ideally we do it at 12 mm. So say your trial frame is showing at 20 mm. You are not able to put it closer because of a prominent nose. So how many of you really use a conversion chart to convert your refraction to 12 mm? If someone has a chart, yeah.
It is there in Adler's physiology book.
But I think it's worth considering, especially
But maybe even in Duke Elders also, that's it. Not here.
So if that is there, let's share it across, because I think ICS with -20 power and things like that, I think that is very crucial. Actually, in a phoropter, you have that water bubble, which we use for construction for knowing this. So phoropter, we can check that. So if it is in the center, the air bubble, that means your alignment is good. So again, one more thing, we can see if there are trial frames with that adjustment. I'm sure it will be there. So that time you won't have the tilt and whatever Dr. Ravindra said, that axis problem should not be there. So that's something very innovative we can do. Another question is, how can we avoid fogging on the lenses? There are a lot of solutions which are popular in the COVID time. So any of you have any hands-on any solutions which we can use to clean the lens to avoid fogging, anti-fog solution? Dr. Prashant, you would have done a lot of research in optics and camera lenses. So any thoughts on that?
Nothing really, but the other point I wanted to bring out is the alignment of the lens itself in the lens case. Many times in the cylinder, when you're using an old aged trial set, the lenses rotate within their holder. I don't know if I am able to give the correct thing.
Yes.
Here it doesn't matter, but the cylinders can rotate within the lens holder. So once in a way, maybe once in a month or 2 months, you can ask your assistant to just check all the cylinder, at least the commonly used cylindrical powers in the lensometer, to just make sure that the cylinder mark in the cylinder is actually coinciding. That is one thing I have found out in my trial set. I have a German trial set which is quite old. It's a full open trial set. So lenses do keep rotating. The cylinders do keep rotating within the holder. I don't know what to call it.
That's very practical, but can you just explain more in detail? How do you check the axis? How do you know it's aligned?
Axis mark on there is an axis mark on the lens.
Correct.
The lens itself will rotate within the case. There's an axis mark. So when you do in the lensometer, you just put the lens in, and whether the cylinder is coinciding to the angle. You put it at 90 degree and see whether the axis, the power you're getting is 90. The cylinder is acting at 90. If it is not, then obviously the lens is rotated within the case. So you have to re-rotate it, or you have to remark the axis on the case. I don't know what to call it, a holder. The lens, you have a ring, and within the ring, the lens is fixed. I hope I don't have a lens to show.
Yes.
So that is one important point. And these days we're using a lot of sanitizer. So the sanitizer, and maybe sometimes we use a glove also. So this smudges the lenses. Many times what happens is smudge will leave linear streaks. That itself can cause a lot of internal reflections and not give the correct vision what the patient can afford. So that we have to keep checking with every patient, every refraction that we do, we need to keep checking the lens, whether the lens that we put inside the frame is clean enough. It's not smudged. These are the only 2 points I think I could add. I have not tried anything for avoiding fogging. Best thing is to use a cloth clean every time.
Okay.
I think Warren Hill downloads, Dr. Sriram has sent a link for vertex distance correction that must be available on the internet to download, I think.
Okay. So move the cylindrical lens holding the rim perfectly horizontal and move up and down looking at a horizontal line. Okay. So Dr. Ravindra has added that tip.
Especially that becomes very relevant. We have to use a corner of the room where the roof and the ceiling and the two walls meet, where it meets, where three lines meet. That is the best way to look at the cylinder and find out if the cylinder is perfectly aligned, if you don't have a lensometer. I usually look at the corner of the room corner where the two walls and the roof meet.
Great. That's a good tip. So any other questions in the chat box, Dr. Prashant?
Let me just check. I'm just trying to monitor the.
Anyone would want to add? Dr. Priyank, anything else you would want to, any other practical situations?
Dr. Deepti. Hello.
Yes, please.
Regarding this treatment of the manifest astigmatism and the topographic astigmatism, recently I was going through one of the webinars, and Dr. Senjav also has given some of the guidelines regarding that. See, his whole idea is when there is a difference between the manifest and the topographic astigmatism. Post-surgery, you feel patients with the rule, if there is a residual which left behind even around 0.75, they will be accepting more comfortably comparing to the against the rule. So the guidelines, what he has given is, if there is a with the rule astigmatism, the manifest astigmatism is more than the topographic astigmatism, he says, treat the manifest astigmatism. Suppose if there is a topographic astigmatism which is higher than the manifest astigmatism, he says, treat the topographic astigmatism, then compensate for the spherical equivalent. Suppose manifest astigmatism is around -3. The topographic astigmatism is -2. So if that is the case, then you are going to treat the topographic astigmatism, compensate for the increased manifest astigmatism, you add 0.5 to the spherical. So that is what you are going to. If there is an against the rule, then the problem starts. If the manifest astigmatism is less than the topographic astigmatism in against the rule criteria, you are going to treat the manifest astigmatism. If the manifest astigmatism is more than the topographic astigmatism, and if it is against the rule, then you treat the manifest astigmatism, then compensate for the topographic astigmatism. The whole idea is, suppose if there is some amount of residual astigmatism which is left behind post-refractive surgery, so try to make them with the rule, they will be more comfortable. That is the whole idea. This is the criteria which has been given.
True, that is very true. So this is for the magnitude of astigmatism. What we were discussing is the axis of astigmatism. So magnitude, what you said is perfect for magnitude, because many times when you do a topo guided, your topo axis cylindrical power is certainly higher. So that adjustment we do, but when there's an axis.
if you don't have a topo guided, you are going to do a simple ASA or LASIK.
That is when you have a mismatch between the axis, you
Right.
would have to consider the manifest axis. So
Yeah,
what
definitely.
you said will go through only in a topo guided
Right.
treatment.
Yes.
Yeah. Otherwise, you're not even considering the astigmatism of your topography. It's only in a topo guided treatment that whatever you said is exactly the rule. So if
No,
you're
if you
not
are
doing a
not,
topo guided treatment, you are going to
then
do your manifest only. You're going to treat your manifest only after a full
even if,
cycloplasia.
even if it is against the rule, if the topo is
Yes, sir.
less
So
than
because
the manifest,
in the topo, you're not considering your lens, you're not considering your foveal axis, you're not considering the posterior cornea. So generally, we don't change much if it is a regular non-topo. So the confusion comes only when it's a topo guided. Because your topo is, we know now so much about the posterior corneal astigmatism. So you may have a residual if you go based on the topo. So all this confusion comes only when you're doing a topo guided treatment, because there you have to treat the astigmatism.
Dr. Deepti, in your case, the case that you presented, the right eye, there was no difference between the manifest and the cycloplegic refraction, dry and
There
wet.
was a little lesser than the left. Right also, he was almost 1.5 lesser in the wet.
No, come again. I'm sorry. I was
It
not.
has to be in both eyes, I think,
Both.
because accommodation excess in only one eye is highly unlikely to happen.
That's the reason I was asking that question.
So left eye, there was a difference of say 2.75. Right eye, there was a difference of almost 1.5 to 1.75. So
How do
both the eyes,
difference?
the wet and dry difference.
Between the two eyes, and there is accommodation. Both eyes should accommodate equally. Why
Yeah,
is there a difference between?
Yeah, a lot of things in the binocular vision which we don't understand. We see a lot of this where there's inequality between both eyes. So we discussed and we couldn't find an answer why that's different. In fact, we
Because
tried.
this is a very common finding, like you say. One eye will neutralize very well, even when you're doing a post PMT, doing a streak to confirm. One eye will be perfectly fine, but the other eye will still show a with movement, and we try to neutralize that, and the patient is not accepting the lower power. This is a very, very common thing that happens even in a non-refractive patient, in a routine outpatient.
True.
And the diochromos show that, I mean, both are almost similar, but still the streak retinoscopy will be going with.
There is some amount of difference for sure between both eyes. You had a similar patient like this, so how are you managing her now? With a gross difference between dry and wet.
In the sense, I mean,
You had a patient very similar to this, where there was a gross difference between the.
no, I mean, initially I tried trying to give them a lower correction, and I was trying to go by my streak retinoscopy. I was very confident with my streak, but the patients were not very happy. So I have to go ahead and give them whatever they're accepting with the duochrome. With the duochrome, most of them are very happy with the spectacle. But so of late, I'm noticing that for refractive surgery, duochrome is probably not the final solution.
Prashant.
Yes, yes.
I'm Prabhu here.
Hi. Nice to see you.
Hello. Yeah. No, basically, in such a situation, sorry, I don't know. I'll remove him because of. In such a situation, I feel when you're doing, I don't know, it's echoing badly.
Echoing.
Yeah.
You have you logged into two devices?
Okay, I'll just check it out. Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
One device, if you can mute it.
Okay.
Prashant, you're also not very clearly audible.
How about now?
Little bit better now, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, is it better now? No.
A lot of echo, Dr. Prabhu.
I'll try to check if there any other device open. Yes.
Dr. Deepti, can I say something?
Yeah, please.
The about the difference in the refraction acceptance as well as objective between small people and dilated people there is a very specific condition that, that's pretty common actually. I don't say you see every day, but at least once in a week, once in few weeks, you can see one or two patients where the refraction is totally different in a dilated pupil status against small pupil status. This is extra accommodative, non-accommodative. This is because of the corneal curvature changes. The central cornea refracts in a different way when compared to a cornea that's exposed by 8 millimeters, 7 millimeters. So in such situation, you can always put a 3 millimeter pinhole like occluder in front of the eye and do the refraction again. Dilated people, cycloplegic, and if there is a huge difference in it, put a 3 millimeter or 2.5 millimeter pupil and do a refraction. So check if that corresponds with the refraction that you got with the dilated people or with non-dilated people. This is one rare example I can say, is not very common. This is something which you'll have to consider. About the pre-presbyopic, I have 1 or 2 points. One is in that age group, also you'll have to do a complete cycloplegic refraction, though the ciliary body, if the patient is coming for LASIK workup, this is very important. And in all these cases, the cover test is important, whether the patient is ortho or exophoric or intermittent exotropic or esophoric. This has to be considered in every patient who is getting LASIK done. So depending upon that, and especially if the patient has got exophoria and you're correcting -6 diopter of power, and post-operatively the patient does not have to accommodate for near, and then the exophoria can lead to a lot of symptomatic, presentations post-operatively. About Dr. Nagbhushan's point, I would like to say that he has a point there, because all Vidrul astigmatism comes down with the age. So do not overcorrect it at any cost. You can correct fully or you can undercorrect it. While all the Agnes rule astigmatism will worsen with the age. So, you cannot overcorrect that again. So there is a small point, what Nagbhushan says. If you have a doubt if you want to doubt whether you want to correct fully or undercorrect or overcorrect, acceptance in Vidrul astigmatism, you plan to correct it, undercorrect, not overcorrect it. If it's Vidrul astigmatism, this is a thumb rule, you should keep it in mind all the time. And if there is a difference in the subjective and objective, topography is not the best machine to look at. You'll have to do a pentacam and check the axis as well as the cylindrical part of the back of the cornea. And as Deepti said, it's it's right to correct on this. If you're sure that your subjective acceptance is absolutely absolutely correct, you must repeat 2-3 times and check if the patient has dry eye. Dry eye can itself give rise to surprise refractive errors, quite an amount. If you correct it, hydrate the cornea well, epithelium contour changes, and then the refraction can change by quarter or half number. So if all those factors are considered, you can, if you have a doubt whether you have to treat with topographic or pentacam, retinoscope or subjective, I would still agree with what Deepti said. Go ahead with the subjective correction, not with the objective. So only in Contura, you forget about subjective. You'll have to treat as per the objective thing in Contura treatment. In standard treatment, you depend more upon the subjective acceptance. If you are sure that your subjective acceptance is right on the dot.
Thank you. Dr. Prabhu, are you there?
And one more thing I would like to say is, whenever you're comparing two letters, whether it is, at the final end, like for example, if you're asking in Jackson's cross cylinder, you're doing JCT examination, ask the patient not to look at the smallest print that he can see. Imagine if the patient's vision is 6/6, go and check on 6/9. Do not ask him a generalized question. Is that better or this better? Ask him to look at a specific letter. If it's a regular astigmatism with the rule against rule, I would prefer a letter H. That's a letter I would ask them to see, or a T, which has got vertical limbs. If it's an oblique one, I'll ask him to look at a letter X. He'll be able to discern the differences much better. And I'll ask him to concentrate on the edge of the letter. Not general question. You ask him to look at H, if it is either with the rule or against the rule, and not the 6-6 vision, but it's 6-9 or 6-12 vision. It should be clearly visible to him. Ask him to focus on the edge of it and ask him what is the difference between that and this. Otherwise, it's very spurious. I mean, he does not understand. He may think that he has to fully understand what question, what answer you're expecting for your question. So this will elicit the perfect balancing of the JCT. If you're doing the duochrome test, see that the green and red one, again, is not the smallest one. See, duochrome test is available on vision charts. And always keep the same letter, H and H, or T and T, or O and O. Ask him to compare green and red. Do not give an X and a T and ask him to compare.
Thank you so much for all those. They're gold mine of an information, Dr. Amrita. Thank you so much. Dr. Prabhu, you're there? You want to speak?
Yeah.
You want to talk?
Yeah.
Much better. Yeah. No echo now.
See, one important point is whenever we are doing a subjective refraction, instead of occluding the one eye, other eye, and trying to do the acceptance of the eye which you are testing, I always try to do, for example, the other eye is -4. So you should always undercorrect the opposite eye and keep it open and try to do the acceptance of the eye which we are testing. Then that accommodative spasm is, like sort of that is generally avoided. So the usual habit is to occlude the other eye and try to do the correction acceptance. That may give the patient will continue to accommodate and try to accept more and more. So keep the other eye, at least you should overcorrect by +1 and then try to do the acceptance. I think that will give a better way. And also when you are trying to do, always try to start with a lesser number. So whatever suppose my AR gives a particular number -3, always start one number less than that and go with 0.25 steps. And with each 0.25 step, there should be one line extra acceptance in the vision chart.
Okay, good point.
But that's a good point, doctor. But then he will not be able to, with the other eye open, he will not be able to concentrate on this eye's vision. So that other eye's blurred vision always will have an influence on this patient. Otherwise, he will to suppress the vision. Suppression means you're coming back to total occlusion. So I would prefer to occlude it completely and assess this eye. And what I suggest is at the end of it, check the vision with both eyes, ask him to relax fully, and before you remove the trial frame and trial lenses from the face, do a retinoscopy. This is the most important step to prevent overcorrection. Imagine you've corrected -2, -2, you have done the duochrome, whatever you want, you're going to remove the trial frame from the face and keep it down. Before that, take your stethoscope, take a +1.5 lens in the left hand, from 75 centimeters, do a retinoscope, that should be neutralized. If it is with moving against or moving with, then you undercorrected or overcorrected. The other thing you can do is you can do what we do called binocular balancing. Okay, keep both the eyes open, put a 2 diopter prism in front of one of the eye. So that will separate the vision between the vertical orientation. So one of the image will be up, one of the image will down. Then he is seeing with both the eyes, but individually vision is there. Then ask him which is better, the upper image or lower image. It's called binocular balancing. It's a very useful test. I mean, if he says one is better, that means probably you're overcorrected or undercorrected that. So this has to happen in every patient.
One more small thing, I don't know, I think everybody must be doing. One more thing, there is once we have come to the final acceptance, always you have to do that +1 blood test. So over that, if you put a +1 test, there should be a 3-line drop in vision. If there is no 2 or 3-line drop in vision, then that means the patient has done over acceptance, and again we should recheck our acceptance.
Yes, an excellent point.
Another point to add to that discussion, Dr. Sudha. I mean, did we discuss about diabetics and refraction? Would you like to add something on that?
In Yeah, actually, when I'm giving glasses for diabetic patients, I always tell them to check their blood sugar before they make the glasses. And if they do come and tell me that their recent recording was on the higher side, I might check the vision, this thing and correction, but I tell them not to make the glasses till the sugar comes under better control. Because the transient hydration of the lens that happens with hyperglycemia can induce myopia, and it might become an overcorrection of spectacles. But this might not be relevant for LASIK, but generally, I mean, that is what I do.
No, the same should
No,
hold good for pre-LASIK evaluation also, isn't it? When you're
Yeah.
doing it for a diabetic.
Yeah.
so as we discussed last time, we're anyway going to
Also
ask
has
for
to be
his.
consistently the same power on 2-3 examinations, at least to make sure that there is no hyperglycemia induced myopia.
So practically, what would be relevant is to have a glucometer in your office, and the day that you're doing a final refraction, just make sure that the sugars are around 160, 180 range. That's what is probably relevant. So I think we have. I think there's one more question I could see.
How many of you use the lens rack or use tri lenses for doing retinoscopy? Or if you don't have a phoropter, I think everybody has to shift over to phoropter. There's nothing, if you want to do a good refraction, phoropter is a must. It's a very small investment, and that's a must for every clinic. Trial frames are, whatever quality they're just not the way we should do refraction. If till then you can buy beautiful French make lens racks are available with the made plastic, and it makes it very easy when you're doing over refraction or primary refraction or even acceptance. So if you have put the trial, you have put -2, just take a +0.5 rack and keep it there. You can go to +1, +5. It'll really make it easy. They're called lens racks. It comes in a vertical array of lenses, starting from +0.5 up to +6. That's a black color. Red one is -0.5 to -6. So and also the patient will be able to respond to it. See, you take a lens and put in the trial frame, ask him, is it better? That's better. Put another lens. This is much faster. Yeah, these are the ones.
So
That's a lens rack.
So I think we can take one last question. Anyone using prisms following LASIK for pre-presbyopic as convergence insufficiency is difficult to treat? Anyone with that experience? Probably no. If Nikhil is there, he can let us know if prisms can be useful.
For convergence insufficiency, prisms would not, we don't use usually prisms. So while treating convergence, while looking at vergence, am I audible?
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
While looking at the vergence, the secondary, we have to check out the accommodation also. Usually what is true convergence insufficiency is, it is always with accommodative excess. When the eye cannot converge, it stimulates the accommodation to finish off the work or to complete the work or to complete the task. So usually we see it in the IT people, where at the end of the day they just flush out. They'll not have that much of patience to work or something like that. So where his convergence is not supporting at the fifth, sixth hour, and his accommodation is supporting to complete his work. And when he is drained of the accommodation also, then he'll start having that problems with the headache, eye pain, all those things. So always checking both the things are very much ideal, I say. So anything of, see, always vergence are related with accommodation. Accommodation is always related with the vergence. So we have to track all those things, and we have to balance each other, or else again we'll end up with having a convergence excess, or with accommodative excess, or divergence excess. We'll end up doing these things. So prism is not ideal way to correct a convergence insufficiency. So therapy would work well in those things. So there are other certain conditions where we use a prism as a primary treatment and vision therapy as a secondary treatment.
And I think, Nikhil, you should share that we have prepared if you have patients with symptoms related to BVA, there's a very nice questionnaire. So probably we can share it in the group. So it's like a dry eye questionnaire. Yeah.
Yeah, there are two kind of questionnaire. One is CISS and one is quality control questionnaires. So which we have combined it and made our own questionnaires, which we will be usually giving it in the OPD if the patient is symptomatic.
So that is something we can really include in the pre-LASIK testing, especially the young IT people. And
can I ask a question here? How do you manage a case of intermittent exotropia with say -6, -6 power in both the eyes? Patient wants LASIK. She has intermittent exotropia, but with good binocular vision, which is again the correction of myopia with glasses or contact lens will help her in correcting the accommodating and correcting some of the exophoria or exotropia she has. And post-operatively, we are going to get rid of this power and get rid of the accommodative component. So how do you counsel her? How do you manage her? How do you treat her? How do you assess her? Nikhil?
Sir? So we have to, so we have to see, we have to check the pre-op and then the post-op. So we have to check all the binocular status of pre-op and then the post-op. If the intermittent has decreased or it is substituted with glasses or contact lenses, then there might not be having a chance of getting intermittent post-op. If it is so, then we can just do it with a small therapies, giving a small sessions of therapies. So because always it is connected with the accommodation.
Correct.
So we can just manage it. If still post-operative also, if the person is in the IT, which we had a case recently, IT and she is stressed out with near work, and again it might lead to accommodative excess and it might be a different case again.
See, assessing the accommodative results of these patients are very important, and you'll have to counsel the patients that this could happen, and you may need strengthening of a binocular vision post-operatively to make her comfortable. This counseling has to go in for all such patients. Same thing happens when somebody is hyperopic and they have esophoria or intermittent esotropia. So same thing applies to them. And the other thing that you should do in all hyperopes is, in addition to just saying that the vision is 6/9 and that's because of amblyopia, always insist on check the fixation, whether it's foveal steady fixation. So it's an art to check the fixation. We all knew, but today nobody uses direct ophthalmoscope, so they would have forgotten about it. So fixation of, using direct ophthalmoscope assessment is very important in hyperop. Otherwise, they'll always be unhappy. Correction of amount of hypermetropia, Nagbhushan. See, the hypermetropia has to be corrected fully. If you want me to explain in very shortly, that may, if you correct it fully, the real hypermetropia the patient has, in addition to the manifest, latent, all that has to be corrected. You'll have to assess the full amount of hypermetropia after a homotropin refraction. Even cyclopentyl is inadequate. So everybody talks about regression in hypermetropia. Regression is more related. It's of course related to the treatment, nomogram treatment pattern itself. There are ways to correct it, but the most of the time it's because of undercorrection. So if you have assessed it, and if there is a huge difference between manifest and the subjective dry refraction, then you will have to explain to the patient that you're going to correct it fully, and you may have to wear some minus glasses to begin with to see far away. For near, never prescribe glasses. To see far away, you may need -0.5, -1. That's rarely happened. In my career, I have treated a lot of hypermetropes. Maybe one or two, I might have given -1 glass or something like that. But then the patient should be told that distance vision will be blurry, near you will be very comfortable, And in a matter of 2 to 3 weeks time, they relax the accommodative spasm and they'll be able to see very well for distance. But in on hypermetropes, you'll have to decenter the ablation, centering to 100% correction of angle kappa. Do not try to undercorrect them. You'll have to accurately assess it before treatment as well as under the table, under the LASIK machine. You'll have to measure the amount of the shift. Otherwise, because the refraction you have done through the center of pupil and refraction in visual axis are different. If you have done objective, if the patient is looking at the fixation target, it has to be through the visual axis. You have done refraction on visual axis. But while doing retinoscopy, you might be, or your objective retinoscopy may be related to your central refraction and not the refraction on the visual axis. So the difference is going to be small, but it's going to matter. And the ablation pattern has to be shifted from central pupil to the Purkinje image. This is a must in hyper. They are very happy patients post LASIK if you take care of these small fine issues.
Great. Thank you. Thank you for all the inputs.
One
Dr.
question
Prashant?
from Dr. Narasimhan. I think that's the last question. I know it's already 10:30. Sir, would you like to unmute and ask this question, sir? Pupil diffraction astigmatism before LASIK? Because I didn't really understand that question. Dr. Narasimhan?
Hi, everybody. Can you hear?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Go ahead, sir.
Can you hear?
Yes, sir. Clear.
Okay. No, generally in myopes, the pupil size is more. In hyperopes, generally it is small. And as we know, the pupil size decreases. The diffraction is a phenomenon which has to be considered and the final, subjective appreciation of the post-LASIK vision. So because we have seen people in pseudophakics especially, the small pupil, the astigmatism of 0.751, they really don't matter. So just wanted to have an input on this.
Can I
Like
answer
here,
this?
yeah, please, you can answer.
No, carry on, Deep.
No, that's exactly what we were discussing about the night myopia, if I understood the question right. So like if you have a wavefront based, like example, this is a Nidec machine. So it says the center refraction is -6 with -3 cylinder. Then this is at the mesopic pupil size, that is 6.73. It is again 6, but the cylinder is dropped by around 0.25, and the difference it says is 0.25. So this is exactly depending on the pupil size and the corneal vertex. So say your pupil, when it is a mesopic, the 6.75 can be 7, 8, or 5 or 4, depending on his maximum pupil in a dark room. So sometimes this can be very different as compared to the center. So that is the point of night myopia, and where he may have a different refraction in the night and different refraction in the day. So very few patients we have had like that, depending on his pupil size. And people who have this significantly, we tell them that in the night you may have a small refraction, because we usually correct them for the daytime refraction, and tell them that you may have a small power for your night driving and things like that. So that is possible, sir, but quite rare in our population. But this sort of a wavefront refraction would really give us a good clue of refraction at different points. And again, as Dr. Ravinder said, that 3 mm pupil aperture is again a very good idea if you want to see what is the refraction caused by the aberration of a large pupil. Yeah, Dr. Ravinder.
Yeah, what he is asking is small people will have a pinhole effect. So when the pinhole effect is there, imagine the patient has 1.5 millimeter pupil, and when you are doing subjective retinoscopy, subjective acceptance, I mean, you will never get an end point. See, with -1 also he'll say is clear, 1.5 also he'll say is clear, 0.5 also he'll say is clear, because it is corrected by the enhanced depth of field, depth of focus.
That's
so
my
there
question.
you'll have to be extremely careful in finalizing. That's a right point. But diffraction increases with small people, while depth of field with
Depth
a
of
small
focus.
people,
Diffraction increases with the
yeah,
reduction in the pupil size.
yes, yeah, diffraction increases and depth of field also increases. So it's it's a very important to finalize the amount of refractive error you're going to decide to correct on the patient.
There's a confusion always I have in small people. Where do you, really stand in correcting it?
No, in that case, the duochrome test gives much better result. Duochrome doesn't depend upon your pupil size. It depends upon the focusing of green light and red light. You can depend more upon the duochrome results and less upon this. And compare with the, see, you would have done an acceptance with the dilated pupil. So whichever is nearest to the dilated pupil refraction is the one which you're going to take it.
Okay, fine. That's a good answer. Yeah.
You
Hello?
finished all the questions on the chat box. Anything else that we have to discuss? It's already 10:34.
Yeah, I think we should close.
We should
close.
close. And thank you. Thanks to everybody for having participated in this and contributed to our motto of learning. And next week, same time, same Friday, we'll have the next session, and there will be we'll start a series of talks by Dr. Deepthi on pentacam evaluation, right, starting from basics to the complexities involved, and we'll have relevant case presentations from any of us. If any of you have any interesting case to share and any complexity that you faced or any ambiguity that you faced, please feel free to share it with one of us so that we can, discuss it and contribute to the discussion. And thank you very much to everybody. Thanks, Dr. Deepthi, Dr. Sudha, Dr. Ravindra, and everybody else. And I think with a good night, let's close.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye
you.
We'll see you all next week.
Next.
Good night.
Thank you. Good night.